Okay, everyone, thank you so much for making it to the very last session we have for this conference. This is a great group. Thank you for staying. We have a fantastic last panel. I'd like to introduce Emmeline Liu and Fran Fiegel, who are going to talk to us and give us a inspirational send-off to this conference. Emmeline and Fran, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, folks. Good afternoon. I don't know how many of you have asthma in the audience, but I do, so pardon the heavy breathing. I'm Fran Fiegel. I serve in a dual role. I serve as president of the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, which is an impact investing field building organization that I'll talk a little bit more about in context in a moment. And I also serve as executive director of the Tipping Point Fund on Impact Investing, which is a 5-year grant-making donor collaborative that supports the public goods that allow all impact capital to flow. So we principally grant support public policy innovation and impact data metrics and measurement. So more to come.
Hi, I'm Emmeline Liu. I'm the general counsel at Calvert Impact. We're a nonprofit impact investing organization. We've been around for about 28 years. We've deployed about $3 billion over that time. And we work both domestically and internationally. And this is my favorite conference that I go to every year, because it's the conference where all the lawyers get together and they say, how do we actually get all this stuff done? So I'm excited.
Yeah, well, thank you both. And just you all saw in the materials that this is largely a conversation between Fran and Emmeline. What we are going to try and do is inject as is interesting and appropriate things that emerged over the past 2 days into their both high-level overview of the sector and the on-the-ground view that Emmeline will be provided. So that's sort of our format here. And I'd just like to kick it off by asking Fran to maybe give us a framing of the field as you're seeing it today. What are you excited about?
Yes, I'm very excited about impact investing, the field of impact investing. We use the term very broadly to include what you folks might consider impact investing, like deep impact investing in private debt and equity and underserved domestic and emerging market segments. But we also look squarely at ESG in both the Tipping Point Fund and the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. And we see these types of investments on a spectrum, but what they unite them is a pairing of impact considerations and financial returns and risk management. So when I use the term, I mean it broadly, and I think it maps really well with the 4 curatorial threads of the conference. And happy to talk about field dynamics and also hear what Emmeline is seeing as well. But wanted to share a little bit about the Alliance's emerging theory of change, which I think relates very, very strongly to the 4 curatorial themes of this conference. So we started in 2016, though I started in the field after I graduated from business school in the late 90s, been at it for a while. And our founding vision at the Alliance was to place measurable social, economic, and environmental impact at the center of all investment decision-making. We believe and know that all investing has an impact, but it is opaque to stakeholders, shareholders, and communities, many other stakeholders. And around 2019, but it's certainly our thinking accelerated in 2020 around the confluence of crises that we've talked about at this conference. We started feeling that the field had evolved to the point where we were beyond advocating for impact investing for impact investing's sake to why are we doing impact investing? We've always been somewhat agnostic about the impact that the investor chooses, the impact entrepreneur chooses. But we began feeling like a lot of our work, and I spoke with someone about this earlier today, that we were tinkering around the edges of a broken system, and that what we really needed to do was use impact investing to try to address the system itself and create a more equitable economic system. And so we do that through And so I would say we're particularly laser focused on the role that impact investors can play in helping to manifest a more equitable economic system. We do it in a couple different ways. One is focus on federal public policy, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and I think Emily will talk about it as well. The second is working with institutional asset owners, mainly foundations, to engage in collective action to try to shape the field from the private sector perspective. So both using public sector levers and private sector levers to try to shape the field. But that the change would not be fully equitable and would definitely not be durable if we didn't also try to revitalize and vitalize, perhaps for the first time, underserved communities, whether we're talking about development finance or whether we're talking about community economic development. And so at the intersection of these two heavy top-down levers, we might have to animate it with bottom-up. Power shifting, power sharing, which was another one of the themes. And so it's really through that lens that we can connect things like the corporate disclosure agenda, ERISA reform, the first presidential veto, fiduciary duty more broadly, and the bottom-up funding that we're doing, whether it's restorative economics, which is relatively nascent, but a very exciting, community development incentives, or supporting diverse fund managers and entrepreneurs. So it's really in that frame that I kind of bring and think about the work that you all are doing and the work that you've discussed today. And I think that that is just a framing mechanism. And I think implied in that is that the field has really evolved from a very niche practice to something that is more mainstream. And evidence of that is that we are in the crosshairs of conservatives at the state level, at the federal level, from a public policy perspective, with the rising anti-ESG movement, focus on woke capitalism, and hope that I can dig in a little bit on some of these later. But over to you, Emily.
So you talked a lot about kind of top-down levers in terms of federal policy and federal funding, and then bottom-up levers, right, in terms of funding social enterprises, funding nonprofits. And so I think Calvert I was asked to speak because we do that. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how we do that. So the first is since 2020, we have built, I think what was last year called the COVID Recovery Funds, one of the nominations for the Grennan Prize last year. And it is leveraging ARPA money, so kind of ARPA and CARES Act money from the federal government given to the states as subsidy to fund a mechanic where we create an off-balance sheet vehicle for CDFIs, in which we purchase somewhere between 80 and 95% of a CDFI's originating loan off of their balance sheet, which has allowed CDFIs to scale 10, 20, 50x of what they were doing 24 months ago, which is incredible. And that is leveraging federal dollars to do that. We also leveraged private markets in that we built a structure in which there was enough subordination that private capital could come in. And so we got a consortium of banks, traditional institutional investors, to fund this asset with the subordinated federal policy dollars being the subordination. So I think it's a really great example of a blended capital structure that was made possible by the policy and also has enacted in kind of grassroots change. So I call that kind of 1.0, which was State CARES Act money. 2.0 is a dream of mine that I think will become reality in the next 12 months. Is leveraging ARPA dollars, which is federal dollars to states again, but building a national model. So when we built this in the first iteration, we did it on a state-by-state level. As all you lawyers know, I had to do 5 different syndicated loan agreements, each with about 12 lenders, a lot of work, right? So in 2.0, to streamline this, we're building one model with one lender, one national facility. And because we've demonstrated to the CDFIs that this is a model they should buy into, they have agreed to standardize all of their form documents. They are doing this on one form document. And we believe that when we get enough assets, we're going to securitize this, right? So can you imagine that we will transform the CDFI industry in presenting a securitized small business product with 90% of the loans going to 10 or fewer employees, 90% of the loans going to businesses of $1 million of revenue or less, 60% of loans going to BIPOC owners, 40% in low-income areas, right? So there's the impact. And this is kind of one of the things. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was we built kind of another product. So another example of this is there's something called PACE legislation, which is tax legislation, which may interest, a small proportion of this room, but we'll put the rest of you to sleep. We just launched something called the Cut Carbon Note. This is an asset-backed security. It is AAA rated. So it's a rated asset-backed security that has pricing in it that the greener a building is, the cheaper the financing for that building owner. And we have demonstrated that this actually causes building owners to build greener buildings. They consider solar when they otherwise wouldn't have. So it's a green bond that's actually changing actions. But we built it to connect to, so it's a state level policy, which is the CPACE policy. It is connecting to private markets because it's a securitization and it's rated, but it's enacting change. And kind of, the other twist that Calvert will put on this, one of our missions from the very beginning was that we wanted to democratize impact, right? Not just impact on the back end, but impact on the front end, meaning that there's a ton of products out there for accredited investors. And when you talk to most lawyers, they'll say, yeah, accredited investors, like that's fine. But, it's so easy to be accredited. You only have to make, $200,000 a year, right? 90% of the US population is not accredited, right? That's not a democratic investment policy. So this product is really unique in that it's issued by a 501c3 and is available to non-accredited investors. So these are kind of a couple of examples of, I think, things that lawyers can build that connect top-down levers with kind of bottom-up change.
I like that last example as a way to add participatory investment product to the retail market. Are you seeing demand for that? And maybe more broadly in the space, what is your business model? But
I'm happy to share it, right? So our community investment note, which has been around since 1995, is a retail product for $20. A citizen of the United States, anywhere in the United States, can buy a $20 note. It's a wonderful introductory investment product to kind of get excited about impact investing. We have over 9,000 investors. We've raised over $3 billion. So I can tell you there's a great track record on that one. I can tell you Cut Carbon launched Tuesday, so I don't know.
But how is it, where is it available? Is it distributed broadly?
It is distributed broadly. It's available in 40 jurisdictions as of today. We hope 42 soon. So in most of the United States, it's available to non-retail investors. But it was really challenging to build, right? It is, to my knowledge, the first retail ABS security. Like, this is not a normal thing. Every time we talk to a lawyer, they said, oh, why do you want to make it retail? That's really hard. You can't just do a private placement.
Is it Blue Sky registered?
It is Blue Sky registered.
As those of us who've been through Blue Sky feel your pain.
50 FedEx envelopes.
Well, we'll change gears a bit. One of the themes that was covered and, our current topic is how the legal community is actually navigating all of these different crises that hit us all at the same time, right? We have the pandemic, we had an interest rate squeeze, which really affected impact investors like us. There's attacks against ESG and impact in general. So I guess one thing I wanted to ask Fran is, in this day and age we live in, what keeps you up at night?
Specifically around the anti-ESG onslaught, or?
In general, we can talk about anti-ESG.
No, but can you just repeat your question? I feel like I missed part of your question.
Well, basically, what do you think are the biggest challenges from your perspective? So we talked about how lawyers are navigating all of these from the ground level, through restructurings, through having to change business models. But what do you see from your perspective?
Got it. So the anti-ESG was leading the witness a little bit. Yeah, so the field has grown in terms of assets under management. The GIN has a biennial research piece that comes out, and I was in Europe last year when they announced that impact investing, as they define it, which is a little bit narrower, doesn't scope in ESG, minimally scopes in public asset classes, perhaps with the exception of green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, was over $1 trillion for the first time. The US SIF numbers are, trillions and scope in a range of negative and positive screens. So in many ways, I feel like the field has mainstreamed. Asset owners are expressing their preferences more and more to wealth advisors and consultants and intermediaries, and you see the asset managers responding accordingly, whether it's, and I don't know if we heard today, well, there was the GC from KKR, I think he's the GC on ESG from Apollo. So we see a lot of asset gathering going on based on the interest of asset owners and the magnitude of the challenges that we're facing. So, and I think it's because of this success, and it's like, a 20, 30-year overnight success. If you think about, I believe the antecedents of the impact investing movement comes from not just religious investors from centuries ago, but from the community development finance world. Locally, in the United States, the Community Reinvestment Act, and then of course, microfinance in emerging markets. So that would be like the 70s. And I think our success is why we're drawing critiques and attacks from the right. And as you probably know in your news feed and all the listservs, you see the extraordinary amount of coverage it's getting. The House Oversight Committee had a two-part hearing on ESG relatively recently. I testified December of last year at the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Capital Markets on human capital management disclosure. So there's been just an extraordinary pushback, both federally and then in terms of public policy through boycott rules where certain main firms, local and national and international firms are blacklisted from doing business with the states, but also prohibiting the use of ESG factors, even financially material ESG factors in deploying state pension funds. So it's full court press. One of the things we talked about in the session on regulation this morning was what I consider to be a potential threat around antitrust that I think is threatening some net zero collaborations in emerging markets. There's a fashion industry coalition to try to lift human rights in the supply chain. And the EU raided several prominent fashion houses, believing that constituted collusion. So there's a lot happening in this space that I believe could trickle down or trickle over to the deeper impact investing work that many of you do. There are other barriers. I'm sure that Emmeline has some, like Calvert, one thing she didn't say about the 25 years plus is that there's never been a default anytime. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll defer to her. But I know that for a very, very long time, even with that kind of track record, it has been incredibly monumentally hard to get on wealth platforms. There are all kinds of reasons for that. A lot of impact funds, for example, are very small. This is a kind of an evergreen product, so it's somewhat different calculus, but there are many reasons, not least of which is fiduciary duty or perception of fiduciary duty, that we have been stiff-armed by the institutional consultants and wealth advisors. I mean, headwinds, I could go on all day, but I'll pass it to you. You probably see others.
I'll probably not say a ton on this. I would say that, we're not ESG. So we actually say it all day long. We are impact investing, right? We invest in private capital solutions. I believe that most of what we invest in is nonpartisan. Climate is probably a little bit more partisan than it should be, but small business loans, that's a very nonpartisan product. And so very much, we believe that we're not ESG, we're impact investing. And so we're less affected by that. But I did want to correct, so we have less than 0.5% default rate. And to tie it to the conference, right, we talked about on the very first day about relationship building, about relational contracting. I won't say that we use relational contracting, but we absolutely use relational underwriting, right? So things that aren't found in your loan documents. We have really great relationships, very deep relationships, very trusting relationships with all of our counterparties. And I think that's why our default rate has been so low.
I think that's a good sort of segue to, Fran, what are some of the solutions you see to some of the challenges you've identified, and how can we think through those together?
Yeah, and just to say a little bit about ESG is absolutely not impact investing, but we see the attacks as we distinguish between what we consider to be the good faith attacks, which are, you know, there should be accountability, there should be transparency, there should be truth in advertising. We are separating that out from the bad faith arguments against pairing impact with returns. And I believe that impact investing is on that spectrum. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, one thing is the Alliance is doing a lot of organizing with other field actors on how to push back, how to have communications harmonization, how to have a grassroots game, which we really don't have, and also to potentially even support litigation in certain states. So that is absolutely a coordinated pushback that we have helped. We've been part of a very broad team in doing that. We've also funded it a little bit on the Tipping Point Fund as well. Gosh, I mean, one interesting conversation that we had before we hopped up here was around the tension between the bespoke deals that we all love to do, and that indeed clients, foundations, high net worth individuals love to do, kind of one-offs, you know, interesting structures, shiny structuring that might not be replicable, against the dire need to get to scale impact. And maybe that's something that you could weigh in on.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about innovation, but what I've also heard at this conference is that innovation can be at tension with markets and whether or not something is sellable, right? I think someone in one of the panels actually said, if I innovate too much, I can't sell it. I heard other people say, why are you building a green bond? This could just be a directed grant, right? Why are you making it so complicated? I also heard other people say, hey, you know, I think the reason that, you know, the very cynical view is I think the reason it's so complicated is so that everyone in this room still has a job. Right? If we make it complicated enough, you know, they'll always need the lawyers. I think that, you know, I think that there is a place for innovation. I think that the small scale is really important. I think that is where we get new ideas. I think that is kind of where I think of the sandbox that you plan. But I think it's also really important to focus on scale. So Calvert focuses a lot on scale. We focus a lot on taking a look at the market and seeing what is ready to be kind of blown up a little bit. What is ready for scale. And when we design products, we very much design for scale. We think that the only way that we're going to solve a lot of the problems that we're worried about is at scale. And that also means that we design a product that looks a lot like a traditional financial product. It needs to be something that the traditional financial markets can recognize. You can design the impact around it, right? This is not to say that we leave impact behind, but you protect the impact and you add that to the traditional financial instrument so that when the investor comes, they say, oh yeah, this is like a general GP/LP structure. This is a general ABS security. This is a corporate bond. I know what that is. I have these weird impact things on it, but I don't need to explain weird impact plus weird structure. I think that you can only be weird in one dimension, and I choose impact at one dimension. And so very much, I think that I absolutely agree. I think that there's a tension between innovation and scale. And Calvert at least has chosen scale at some level.
Do you mind if I respond? I couldn't agree with you more. When I used to be the chief investment officer at Impact Assets, and we were kind of taking a a cue from the Calvert Community Investment Note. And we felt like the market can only tolerate so much innovation. They can tolerate innovation and structure, or they can tolerate impact, but they can't tolerate both. It's just like, it just doesn't fit. The other barrier that I think is real is the perception versus the reality of fiduciary duty, which is, I believe that fiduciary duty is undergoing a revolution, whether it's taking material ESG factors into account and allowing that. I think now it's, according to ERISA anyway, you may take them into account. I'd like to get to a place where fiduciaries must take financially material factors into account, or you breach your fiduciary duty. And my kind of right tail swing for the fences is more of the double materiality view that is being adopted in the EU. But given our current situation in Washington, I just don't see how we get there from here. And so one of the things that we ran into, and I was wondering if you run into it too, is that when we brought that product to the wealth platforms, it was too concessionary for the perceived risk. And so they thought, well, we can maybe add it to our donor advised fund offering, but that's as far as we got. And what I am hearing more and more from the wealth platforms and consultants is that the ultra high net worth individuals want the deep impact stuff that Emmeline and colleagues are doing. And that the wealth advisors are going to need to evolve, or there'll be asset attrition. That nothing more. Asset attrition is like the phrase that makes RIAs put down their iPhones. And we all have these high profile examples, you know, Jim Sorensen, Liesl Pritzker Simmons, and Ian Simmons, who left their families' wealth advisors because they wanted something else. And I think as we see this coming wealth transfer to women, then millennials, and ultimately Gen Zs, if the wealth advisory firms don't evolve, I think that they're going to lose assets under management.
I absolutely agree. You know, it has been a 25-year education process, right? We do a lot of education for our investors about our community investment note, about the other products. I'm sure that you all do a ton of education for your investors, educating about, you know, your structures and about risk. So yeah, I absolutely agree. But I like what someone suggested in our last panel, which is this is not concessionary capital. This is paying for impact. You need to pay an impact premium. And I think the example that they gave was, you know, when you buy a fair trade, you know, piece of chocolate, you know, you're paying more than market price, right? So why aren't you being willing to pay for impact? So I would love to rebrand it. Is not using concessionary capital anymore, but yeah, we've hit very much the same things.
You mentioned high net worth individuals and DAFs and foundations, and I would be remiss to not sort of bring up a conversation that we had at lunch today around, which was basically rooted in tax policy, so not exactly about impact, but we have seen a lot of high net worth individuals sort of complementing or replacing private foundations, which are the typical mechanism for their philanthropy, with hybrid structures, sort of LLCs side by side, or using DAFs actually more and more. I'm curious, and again, not to get into the tax policy side, but what has been the impact on that structuring in both the industry and have you seen any impact on the day-to-day of an operating public charity in terms of the capital flow, et cetera?
I don't know that we've seen a ton of change. We don't get a lot of direct DAF kind of or foundation investing. Impact assets spun out of Calvert Impact several years ago. I think the one thing I would love to see foundations fund is the work to build the pipeline, right? The work that everyone in this room, and this might be a very selfish plug, but the work that you all do is really, really hard. The work that we do is hard. It's not sexy, right? Everyone wants to fund results. No one wants to fund the plumbing that gets you that result. Where we have actually seen some funding come through is we've seen like high net worth individuals or private foundations actually fund some of the work that we're doing to build the pipeline, which we're really grateful for. We are going to be an applicant for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And we have definitely talked to foundations about funding some of that work.
Yeah, so foundations and DAFs and LLCs. It's hard to know what money is moving from LLCs because it's an opaque wrapper. For that matter, foundations are a relatively opaque wrapper. If I'm sure this crew, like me, likes to look at 990s. And I feel like I can admit that in this group. I like to read 990s. And there is very little about the endowment holdings. Sometimes PRs are listed out, but it's very hard to see what the endowment holds, especially for the bigger foundations. So I think that there is opacity, and I think that foundations, because they at its inception get a big, there's foregone tax that the American people have not enjoyed, that you owe transparency in exchange. So the answer is, I don't know. I wish I did. I see putting myself in a position of a high net worth individual. I'll be like a millennial high net worth individual. I want to come back as a millennial high net worth individual. So if I were a high net worth millennial, I see the wisdom of an LLC, because you don't have to be thinking about, fiduciary duty, convincing your board, convincing your outside board directors, recalcitrant CIOs, recalcitrant board members. You can kind of do what you want. So I get that. But it's very hard to answer that question. We've been doing some research that's publicly available, looking at how to leverage institutional balance sheets for impact. We had a report called Impact on the Balance that looked at foundations and tools for leveraging the liability side of their balance sheet. We talk so much about PRIs and MRIs on the asset side of the balance sheet, but asking foundations to consider guarantees and other things that are sort of, there's so much untapped impact in the balance sheet. And also we looked at the range of ESG or social impact bonds that were issued by certain foundations during the COVID crisis as a way of increasing grant payout. And I almost thought of it as like a time impact arbitrage play. The getting was good in terms of the interest rates were very low. So it was a very good time to do it. We just came out last week with another report about leveraging corporate balance sheets for impact. And we tried to look at some of the social, racial justice commitments that were made following the murder of George Floyd, to see less which ones, actually got delivered. It was not an accountability report, but it's more about how can we make corporate impact investing more of a durable, reliable source of capital for the deals that and the constituencies we care about.
Great, thank you. So as we close out the conference, just wondering, what would you want to say to this wonderful group of lawyers who are so full of information about the impact investing space and very excited to do things out there? What would you want to leave them with?
So I mentioned earlier that we think the future of investing is impact investing. We think all investing has an impact, and we believe that once a global corporate disclosure agenda comes to fruition, whether it'll be interoperable across jurisdictions is, a subject for another time. Once we have truth in advertising for funds, accountability across supply chains, we will be able to see the assets. And I feel like there has been, the externalities are off balance sheet and they are going to come on balance sheet, and there's going to be a wholesale reassessment of what constitutes value. So I am very excited about that. The other thing I wanted to just quickly mention is the Alliance runs a group called the President's Council on Impact Investing. It's a group of 20 US foundation presidents that or leaders in impact investing and their senior staff, both grant makers and the folks that deploy the impact capital, both PRI and MRI. And I always say that the presidents we facilitate a lot of meetings with them, and they are just delightful. The senior staff is really, they're tough, as they should be. But I live in fear of foundation general counsels. They are the ones that kind of come in and say no, basically. And so I guess my call to action would be, how to get to yes and to bring an open mind to these deals. And as Emmeline and I talked about earlier, maybe getting involved earlier in the deal. But I think that sometimes GCs have to say no because the deal, they weren't brought in earlier. And so how can GCs and your staffs be more involved earlier so that we get to the creativity, we get to the scale, and we get past no?
I guess I'll dovetail off of that, which is, we're not scary, I promise. But I guess my call to action, I know that Deborah, you always really love a call to action. I think is twofold. I think the first is to look to build scalable projects, right? To look when you're innovating, to think about what is scalable, because I think our problems are big, so our solutions have to be big. I think the second is, well, we're in law school. This is not a law school exam. I will let you cheat off of my paper if you let me cheat off of yours. My documents are not that special, neither are yours. I've seen them. And so share them, right? I will make a promise, and I've always made this promise in this conference, that you call me, I will absolutely talk you through every structure, all the failures that we've hit. And I'm incredibly grateful. I think that this conference has so much generosity among everybody, where, the panel yesterday where all the innovative things came up, right? Everyone talked through their structures so that other people can copy them, right? Like, let's all copy off each other's papers. And I think that is my call to action for you all, is to share.
So we have foundation GCs need to, and if I only knew one, be better. And let's start cheating. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Emmeline, for such a great conversation. And I think this was I think a great conversation that pulled together the threads from over the past few days and created a great tapestry that succeeded in being both inspirational and forward-looking, but also very practical. So thank you again for that. It wasn't a simple task. You've done it so well. So again, thank you so much. How do we move forward and continue to do our part in towards the ever important change we seek, and the organizations that we represent, the change that they want to see in the face of ever evolving and very daunting challenges? We heard this morning from Amelie that stat about 70 to 700 million moving recently from back into, which I think is a key part of that, into extreme poverty. Just one example of the challenges that we're facing in an evolving world. I don't think there's a simple answer to how we address that. And I think a lot of the substance that we've talked through together and the work that we're doing together can begin to answer that, but it's still hard. I have hope though. Why? Maybe I look back to some of the substance and say, hey, we have some solutions. If we do them at scale, if we don't say no, but actually more than that, I think back to the opening plenary where Kate, David, and Oliver talked a lot about the relational aspects of all of the work that we do. They were focused on contracts, but the larger message, which actually I heard repeated through many of our panels since then, was that relationships built around guiding principles, shared purpose, trust, they're usually more successful. And those relationships lead to value creation, not just finite value protection. And I think that really embodies the reason why we come to this conference, right? It is creating a community of practice, even a community of friends, if I would dare say that, because many of you have become dear friends over time, and I see that happening. And through those relationships, we're doing what this conference is meant to do. We're creating value in the face of really, really overwhelming but important obstacles. So thank you all for participating in that and continuing to participate that over time. You've heard it many times over the past few days. I want to say it again. Thank you to the program committee. Thank you to my co-chairs, Ginny, Amelie. Thanks so much to the Brennan Center and NYU Law School, Deborah Brand, for all of the work that they have done. Obviously, this is a very big project and an event, and it has played out so beautifully, if I dare say so. As a reminder, we'll be distributing a survey soon to get your feedback. As good as it was, we want to make it better. So please, we invite you to respond to those. I know I often overlook surveys. I will not overlook this one, and please join me in providing additional feedback. On that note, it's never too late to start thinking about next year's conference. Many of you will receive invites to be participants in the program committee, theme leaders, perhaps even co-chairs. Look out for those, and as we heard, GCs and legal staff should say yes. So this is an opportunity to practice saying yes. Right now, it's scheduled for June 4th and 5th of 2024, so you can go ahead and block your calendars and think about travel. Thank you again so much. I'm going to invite Deborah Brand for a final word, and then we'll say goodbye.
It's bittersweet. Thank God it's over. And darn, I haven't talked to every single one of you yet. So I just want to thank you again for the attitude that you brought to this conference and that you bring to your work every day. It's inspiring, it's challenging, it's provocative, and it makes me very, very hopeful. So thank you to all of you. If you liked what we did here, the Brennan Center is hiring. I have 4 positions. Find me. I am looking for executive director, a director of research and publication, and teaching fellows. So there's lots of ways you can become part of this community in an even deeper way. And you can help us do the conference next year. So with that, I also want to acknowledge Amaris White, who is going to be leaving us, and she's just done a fabulous job. And our program assistant, Lise Ponte, and I don't know if she is, there she is. Hi, Lise, and Lise as well. So with that, let me just say thank you and see you next year.